A Heart Worth the Risk, author by Ali. The clock on the peeling kitchen wall blinked 2:13 a.m., its red digits flickering faintly in the dimness of the apartment. Outside, the city groaned and exhaled, sirens in the distance, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the hum of life that never fully slept. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the raspy breathing of the baby in Alison's arms. She rocked him gently, her body aching with exhaustion. Her legs were numb beneath her, but she dared not move. Elijah's breaths came in short bursts, strained and uneven, each inhale a battle, each exhale a fragile victory. The oxygen machine clicked and hissed softly beside her, its tubes coiled like a lifeline between them. "Just a little longer, baby," she whispered, kissing his damp forehead. "Mommy's here." He stirred, a soft, pained sound leaving his lips. His tiny fingers curled around her shirt, and Alison swallowed the sob that built in her throat. He was barely 9 months old and had already spent more time in hospitals than she had in her whole life. She pressed her cheek to his sparse curls and let her tears fall silently. Crying made no difference, but sometimes it was the only thing that kept her from shattering completely. She had nothing left, not in her fridge, not in her savings, not in her strength. Her job at the diner barely covered rent, let alone Elijah's mounting prescriptions and doctor's appointments. Medicaid helped, but it didn't cover the supplemental oxygen tank they now needed at home. It didn't pay for the expensive pulmonary specialist in Boston who had told her, so gently, that without consistent treatment, her baby's chances of surviving the next year were uncertain. And yet, despite the darkness, she hadn't touched the emergency card tucked away in her wallet. The one with William Carrington's number on it. She hadn't seen him in over a year. Not since that whirlwind night. One perfect night that had turned into a perfect storm. She'd never planned to keep his child a secret, but when the pregnancy test came back positive and her first call to him was intercepted by his assistant, the truth had started to feel dangerous. Because William wasn't just a man. He was a Carrington, CEO of a Fortune 500 empire, always in the headlines, always under scrutiny. He had a board to answer to, a billion-dollar legacy to protect. What would a baby do to that? Worse, what would a scandal with a waitress he barely knew do? So she'd stayed silent, disappeared from his life without a trace. But tonight, Elijah's breathing was worse. His color was off. He needed a doctor, and she had no money left for an ER visit. The last doctor had told her Elijah needed in-home respiratory support. A mobile unit. That would cost thousands. With trembling hands, Alison reached into the drawer by the sink, found her wallet, and pulled the card out. She stared at it under the glow of the stove light, the bold black print swimming in her vision. William Carrington, personal line. She held it for a long time. "I don't want your money," she whispered into the dark. "I just want him to live." Her thumb hovered over the number on her phone. Then, with a breath that tasted like surrender, she typed, "William, I'm sorry for the silence. This isn't about us. But there's something you need to know. His name is Elijah. He's yours. And he's sick." She hit send, then clutched her son tighter and waited for a reply that might never come. William Carrington was wide awake, but he pretended otherwise. He sat alone in his penthouse office, a crystal tumbler of untouched bourbon in one hand and his phone in the other, the skyline of Boston glittering like 1,000 empty promises beyond the wall of glass. His tie was gone. The first 3 buttons of his shirt hung open. His hair, usually a carefully constructed part of the Carrington image, was ruffled, as though he'd run his hands through it too many times. A text alert buzzed at exactly 2:47 a.m. His eyes flicked down, expecting a board update, maybe a calendar changed from his assistant. What he saw instead made his breath still and the edges of the room blur. William, I'm sorry for the silence. This isn't about us. But there's something you need to know. His name is Elijah. He's yours. And he's sick. He read it once. Then again. And again. He didn't move, didn't blink. The words didn't make sense at first, not because he didn't understand them, but because they landed like shrapnel in the quiet, curated war zone of his life. Alison, he hadn't heard that name in over a year, not since their paths had crossed unexpectedly at the company gala in D.C., the one he had almost skipped. She'd been working the bar that night. He remembered how her laugh had broken through the polished crowd like sunlight through stained glass. He remembered the way she hadn't fawned over him, hadn't cared about his last name or his business empire. One night had turned into a weekend. But by Monday morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, no way to find her. Just a silence that stung more than it should have. He'd buried the confusion, the faint sense of loss, and turned his focus back to Carrington International. Back to quarterly earnings, new mergers, and strategic pivots. That was what he knew. What he could control. Until now. Until this message. He rose slowly from the desk, the tumbler slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Bourbon spread in a puddle across the marble tile, but he didn't notice. He was already scrolling back, rereading the message, parsing every word. His name is Elijah. William's throat tightened. He opened her contact, pressed call, and waited. It rang. Once, twice, 5 times. Voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he threw on a blazer, grabbed his car keys, and barked an address to the intercom. Have the jet ready in 20 minutes. We're going to New York. The streets of Queens were barely waking up when William's black SUV pulled up outside a crumbling apartment building. The sky had turned a pale shade of pink, and the air was thick with the weight of an August dawn. William had never been here before, but the driver had followed the GPS to the exact address Alison had left on her old employee file, long since inactive but still buried in the company archives. A lucky break. Or fate. He stepped out into the narrow sidewalk, the scent of exhaust and overripe garbage curling around him. His custom shoes crunched over broken glass. Somewhere nearby, a baby was crying. His heart thudded. Please, God, don't let me be too late. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, pounding on the apartment door marked 4B. There was a rustle inside. A hesitant pause. Then the door creaked open. Alison stood in the frame, hair tied back in a messy bun, eyes swollen from sleep and tears. She held a bundled-up baby in one arm, oxygen tubes looped around the infant's nose. Her mouth parted when she saw him. They stared at each other for a moment that stretched endlessly. I got your message, William said, voice rough. Where is he? She stepped aside without a word. And just like that, his world stopped spinning. William stepped into the apartment, and the air hit him all at once. It was warm and stale, filled with the scent of formula, something sour and metallic, maybe disinfectant, and something else he couldn't name. Not unclean, just tired. The walls were faded, the furniture sparse and mismatched. A battered love seat with a baby blanket draped over it. An oxygen machine humming in the corner. Bottles lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers ready for war. This wasn't a home. It was a battleground. And Alison was the only soldier left standing. She watched him as he moved through the room, but said nothing. Her arms tightened protectively around the baby as he neared. William stopped a few feet away. His heart pounded, loud in his ears. Is that him? He asked quietly. Alison nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. This is Elijah. William's breath caught as he looked down at the child in her arms. He was smaller than he expected. Fragile. Pale. Tubes in his nose. Dark circles beneath his tiny eyes. But there, beneath the tiredness, was something unmistakable. His chin. His mother's lips. His father's eyes. William reached out, then paused. "Can I hold him?" Alison hesitated. She was trembling. "He's weak," she said. "Be gentle." Carefully, she passed Elijah into his arms. William's entire body stiffened, like he was holding a miracle he didn't deserve. The baby stirred against him, his breathing wheezy, but his eyes fluttered open for a moment, blue and round like his mother's. William sat down slowly on the couch, the child tucked against his chest. "He's mine," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Alison sat across from him, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I tried to call you," she said, her voice cracking, "when I found out. But your assistant, she said you were out of the country, that you didn't want distractions." I never got that message," William said sharply, but not unkindly. "If I had, I would have come." "I know that now." Her eyes shimmered. "But back then, I didn't. And by the time I worked up the courage to try again, I was already showing. I didn't want you to feel trapped, or worse, like it was some kind of setup. I wanted to believe I could do it on my own." William looked down at Elijah. The baby had settled against him, impossibly small, impossibly real. His chest rose and fell with shallow effort, the oxygen tank hissing beside them. "You shouldn't have had to," William said softly. "Not with my child." Alison's voice was hollow. "I didn't want to ruin your life." William's head snapped up. "Ruin my life?" "You're William Carrington," she said. "The Carrington name is on skyscrapers. You're the face of a billion-dollar empire. You're in Forbes, William. I'm a waitress who got pregnant after a weekend. Do you know what people would have said? What your board would have done?" William looked away. Truth be told, she was right. His father had drilled it into him from the time he could walk. Image was everything. One scandal, one misstep, and everything could come crumbling down. Shareholders didn't care about love. They cared about numbers. But staring down at Elijah, that world suddenly felt miles away. "I built Carrington International from the ground up," William said after a long silence. "I clawed my way to the top. I sacrificed everything, sleep, relationships, time, because I thought it would all be worth it one day." He looked at Alison, eyes blazing. "And now, I'm sitting here holding the only thing that's ever actually mattered. And I almost missed it because I was too busy pretending I didn't want something real." Alison blinked, startled by the intensity in his voice. "I don't care what the board says," William said. "I don't care what the media says. He's mine. You're mine. And I'm not walking away." Her voice shook. "They'll crucify you." "Let them try." He looked down at Elijah again, his heart thudding hard. "I'd trade every dollar I've ever made just to hear him breathe easier." The oxygen tank hissed quietly in the corner. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, bleeding soft gold through the tattered curtains and casting halos over the modest room. William hadn't moved in hours. He sat still on the couch, one arm curved protectively around Elijah, the other gently brushing his tiny back as he slept. The baby's breathing was faintly better, shallow but steady. William's own breaths matched him, slow and deliberate, as though his lungs had learned their rhythm from the fragile life in his arms. He had never held a baby before. Not even his sister's. And now, here he was, holding his son. His. The word still rang like an echo in his chest. Alison moved quietly in the kitchen, boiling water for formula and wiping down the counter with practiced movements. She didn't speak much, only occasionally glanced over to see if Elijah was still okay in William's arms. The weight of the moment, the surrealness of it, hung thick between them. William finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does he always wheeze like this?" Alison paused, hand tightening on a spoon. "On bad days. He has underdeveloped lungs. It started shortly after birth, pediatric bronchopulmonary dysplasia. They said it was likely from being born early. His lungs just didn't finish." William's jaw clenched. "And the hospital? What are they doing?" "They did what they could," she said quietly. "But it's expensive. The oxygen is rented, and he's supposed to be on something portable all the time now. I'm behind on payments, and they won't release the mobile unit until I cover the last 3 months." "How much?" Alison shook her head. "Doesn't matter." "How much, Alison?" "4,000. William didn't even blink. "I'll transfer 10 by noon." She looked up, startled. "No, I didn't call you for that. You called me because my son is sick." He met her eyes, his own swimming with unspoken guilt. "Because I should have been here. And because no matter how this started, I have a right to be his father. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Alison swallowed hard and looked away, blinking back tears. "I watched him choke on air last week," she whispered. "There was a moment I thought he'd stop breathing entirely. I had nothing in the house but an old humidifier and prayers. I was so scared. I just froze." William stood slowly, careful not to wake the sleeping baby. He crossed to her and stopped just inches away. "I wasn't there when you needed me," he said softly. "But I'm here now." She turned toward him slowly, her eyes rimmed red. "It's not just the money, William. You're Carrington. The board, the media, they'll rip this apart. You know what they'll say. Waitress traps billionaire with baby. They'll think I planned this." "I know," he said, jaw tight. "And I don't care." "You say that now," she whispered. "But what about tomorrow? What happens when the press leaks this, and your face is on every screen? When shareholders want you gone? When your father calls?" William took a slow breath. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the man my father wanted me to be," he said. "The man the world respects. And for what? To wake up at 40 with no one who really knows me." He looked down at Elijah again. "That ends today." Alison's expression softened, guarded but vulnerable. "You'll give it all up?" she asked. "For us?" "No," William said. "I'll fight for it because of us." He gently returned Elijah to her arms, brushing a kiss over the baby's temple. "I want you both to come with me," he said. "To Vermont. I have a lake house there. No cameras. No reporters. Just space. Fresh air. Quiet. He needs that. You need that." She blinked, stunned. "You want me to run away with you?" "No," he said, his voice tender but firm. "I want to start over. Somewhere no one's watching. Just for a while. Just us." Alison stared down at the child in her arms. "You barely know him," she whispered. "I know enough," William replied. "I know I'd die before I let anything happen to him." She didn't respond right away. But she didn't say no either. And in that silence, hope bloomed, delicate, new, and still learning how to breathe. The days that followed were a blur of hasty decisions, stolen moments, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. William and Alison barely slept. In the late hours of the night, while Elijah rested between the hum of the oxygen machine and the distant rumble of the city outside, they began to make their plans. His jet would be ready by morning, and they would disappear. No fanfare. No promises. Just an escape. For the first time in months, Alison felt something she hadn't dared to in so long. Hope. The apartment was a mess, clothes scattered across the floor, bottles left half empty on the counter, Elijah's toys pushed aside, but to her, it was home. It had always been the only thing she could offer him. And yet, now it felt more like a cage. With William there, with the possibility of a new life somewhere else, it was almost as if the weight she'd been carrying for so long could be lifted. But she couldn't ignore the nagging fear that gripped her heart. Could this really be the start of something new? Or was this a dream that would shatter when the world came crashing in? By the time they reached the airport, it was already too late. The press had caught wind of the billionaire's mysterious disappearance. It had started as a whisper, sightings of his jet, rumors about a sudden flight to New York, but by the time William and Alison were boarding, it was an inferno. The paparazzi had gathered in full force, cameras flashing like 1,000 blinding lights. William, is it true? You're a father. Did you know about the baby? Was it a secret? Are you abandoning your company to raise the child? The questions rained down on them as they made their way up the stairs to the plane. Alison's stomach churned, and William's jaw clenched, but he kept walking forward, never once looking back at the growing crowd below. Once inside the plane, the doors locked behind them, sealing them into a bubble of silence. William collapsed into a seat, his fingers working at the tension in his neck. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "I should have known they'd find out." Alison sat beside him, her hands trembling as she glanced out the window at the chaotic scene below. "Maybe we should have waited," she whispered. "Maybe we should have thought this through." William looked at her, his gaze softening. "I don't regret a single thing," he said firmly, "and neither should you." The plane took off, the roar of the engines cutting through the noise and the world below them. As they rose higher, the noise from the outside world became a distant hum, and for the first time in days, the oppressive weight on Alison's shoulders began to lift. It didn't last long. By the time they landed in Vermont, the storm had already broken. The press had gotten hold of every piece of information they could find. A few quick photos from the paparazzi had quickly turned into a full-fledged news cycle. It wasn't just William's departure from Boston that grabbed attention. No, it was the fact that he had gone with a woman no one had seen before, Alison, a single mother with no ties to his world. And now, news outlets were running with the headline. Billionaire CEO Carrington disappears with mysterious woman and baby, a family secret exposed? The story was everywhere. Headlines screamed about the affair, about the scandal brewing in the Carrington boardrooms, about the family betrayal. The shares of Carrington International began to dip as the media spun their own version of events. "Look at this," Alison murmured, holding her phone out for William to see as they walked through the front door of the lake house. William scanned the screen, his eyes darkening. "Damn vultures. What do we do?" Alison asked, her voice barely audible as she glanced out at the peaceful Vermont countryside beyond the glass doors. The contrast between the serenity of their new surroundings and the chaos waiting for them back in Boston was jarring. William stood still, his gaze fixed on the article. "I'm going to face it," he said. "The board. My father. All of it. They can't tear me apart without a fight." "You don't have to," she protested, her voice trembling with the uncertainty that lingered like fog around them. "You don't have to give up everything just for us. You've worked your whole life for Carrington. Your company, your legacy." His hand cut through the air between them. "No," he said firmly. "My legacy was never worth it if it meant losing the chance to really live. I can rebuild everything else, Alison. But this," he looked down at Elijah, who was still in her arms, sleeping peacefully for the moment. "This is something worth fighting for." The day turned into night, and as they sat at the dining table in the cozy house, everything outside seemed so far away. The world of boardrooms and business deals felt like another lifetime. For the first time, They could hear the sound of their own voices without the constant clamor of the outside world. They had the space to breathe. But that peace was fleeting. The phone rang in the other room. Then it rang again. And again. William checked the screen. It was his assistant. He picked it up with a resigned sigh. Yes. Mr. Carrington, there's been an emergency board meeting. The shares have dropped nearly 15% since the story broke. Your father wants you back in Boston as soon as possible. William's fingers clenched around the phone, but his voice was calm. I'm not coming back. Not yet. Sir, the press. I don't care about the press, William snapped, then softened. I'll deal with it. Just hold the fort down. He hung up and turned to Alison, who had been listening intently. Your father's angry, she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Not just my father. The entire board. They'll pressure me to come back and clear this up. But I won't do it on their terms. I'm not going to apologize for being a father. Alison stood, walking to the window. She wrapped her arms around herself, her mind racing with what this would all mean for them, for Elijah. What happens now? She asked quietly. What do we do when the world comes knocking? William walked to her side, standing tall despite the weight of the situation. We face it together, he said. We face everything together. The days that followed were marked by a sense of urgency, but it wasn't the kind of frantic rush that William was used to. This wasn't about meetings, mergers, or deals. It was about finding stability, about securing something real. And for the first time, William knew what it was like to feel truly vulnerable. It wasn't the boardroom that made him sweat anymore. It wasn't the weight of a contract or the pressure to perform. It was Elijah. It was Alison. And as each day passed in Vermont, with the distant hum of media chaos outside their bubble, William found something within himself he had long buried. He wasn't afraid of losing everything anymore. He was afraid of not being there for his family when they needed him most. It was late afternoon when Alison came into the living room with Elijah in her arms. The baby was small, his face still too fragile and pale, but there was something in his eyes now. Something William had seen that morning but hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Hope. The baby was beginning to show signs of improvement. His breathing was easier, his color less ashen, and his small, chubby hands gripped at his mother's fingers. You're getting stronger, Alison said softly, almost as if speaking to herself as she watched Elijah. Every day. I can see it. William stood from his seat by the window, his gaze softening as he approached. It's a good sign. He's tough. Alison smiled faintly, but there was an exhaustion behind her eyes that hadn't disappeared. The past few days had been a whirlwind, trying to balance Elijah's needs with the storm of media attention and William's looming decisions. Even now, she couldn't quite shake the fear that they were just one step away from it all unraveling. You're really staying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not going to leave us once the press dies down? William met her eyes. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not without you. Not without him. She bit her lip, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. But the company. William shook his head, stepping closer. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The company is a part of me, but it's not all of me. And I'm not going to sacrifice this. For you, for him, for anything. He looked at Elijah, who was already half asleep in his mother's arms. You've been through too much on your own. I won't let that happen again. Alison blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. You mean that? He nodded, his eyes steady and unwavering. I'm done living for everyone else. For appearances. For a company I built on my own but never learned to share. I'm not going to make the same mistake again. Alison couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They slipped down her cheeks, but this time, they were different. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that had been building in her chest ever since William had stepped into their lives. He wasn't perfect, he had his flaws, his fears, but he was here. For her. For Elijah. For what it's worth, William said softly, I'd give it all up in a heartbeat. And as Alison stood there, cradling their son, she realized just how much had changed. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first found out she was pregnant. That woman had been scared. Alone. Desperate for answers, for help. But this woman, standing next to William in this small, quiet house, was different. She was stronger, yes, but more than that, she was seen. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a burden or an afterthought. She was a mother, a partner, a woman with everything to lose. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to fight for it. The following days were filled with slow, careful routines. William adjusted to a new life of diapers, late-night feedings, and tender moments where he would hold Elijah while Alison prepared dinner. It wasn't easy, and the media never truly went away, but there was something unspoken between them now, a shared determination. They would face whatever came next together. Alison found herself sleeping better, even when the headlines threatened to pull her back into a world she'd escaped. She no longer felt like a fugitive. With William beside her, the weight of her past struggles felt lighter. She realized that he wasn't just there for her because of Elijah. He was there for her because he needed her, too. By the time they had been in Vermont for a week, they were starting to plan their return. William had faced the storm of media pressure head-on, speaking to the press for the first time about his decision to prioritize his family over his career. And though the board was less than thrilled, his personal assistant was slowly managing the crisis. The shares of Carrington International had stabilized, but there was no going back to business as usual. William knew that now. He needed more than the empire. He needed a life. A real one. The day they decided to head back to Boston was the same day the first whispers of reconciliation began. The press had begun to soften their coverage of the situation, focusing more on Elijah's recovery and William's dedication as a father than on the scandalous rumors. They were still being watched, but the fire of judgment had dimmed somewhat. Alison stood at the window, watching the plane prepare for takeoff. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice quiet. William came up beside her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm sure," he said, his lips brushing her temple. "It's time to face everything. Together." She looked up at him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. "We can't undo what's happened," she said. "No," he agreed, his voice steady. "But we can choose what comes next." And for the first time, Alison realized he was right. They were stepping back into the world. Into the storm that had followed them to Vermont. But now they were a family, and no matter what came their way, nothing could tear them apart. The flight back to Boston was eerily calm. The world outside the plane seemed so distant now, so small, so far removed from the whirlwind of tabloids and accusations that had become their reality. William sat beside Alison, Elijah nestled in her arms, fast asleep for the time being, oblivious to the chaos that had surrounded them for the past week. As the city's skyline came into view, Alison felt a tightening in her chest. The thought of returning to the world that had once been hers, but now felt so foreign, was overwhelming. The quiet life they'd carved out in Vermont had been a refuge. The noise of the city, the pressure of William's corporate world, the demands of the media, it all felt like a distant memory. But now it was rushing back. William squeezed her hand, sensing her unease. "We're doing this together," he whispered, his voice reassuring but filled with the same uncertainty. "This is our life now. I'll face the board. I'll face my father. And we'll do it on our terms." Alison nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the hope that everything would be okay. But the reality was far more complicated. Her heart ached for what they had left behind, for the life she had built for herself and Elijah in Vermont, where they didn't have to answer to anyone but each other. Could they really go back to the pressure, the scrutiny? Could she really be part of this new life William was offering? When they landed at Logan International, the reality of their return hit them like a tidal wave. The press had found out about their arrival before they even touched down, and there were cameras waiting at the terminal. Their return was a media circus, flashbulbs blinding them as they made their way through the airport, reporters shouting questions, the hum of excitement from the crowd almost deafening. "William, is this your child? Are you abandoning Carrington for a family? How will this affect your business?" Alison kept her head down, trying to shield Elijah's face from the barrage of questions. She could feel William's hand tighten around hers, but he didn't flinch. He kept walking, his expression hardening with each passing step. They had arranged for a private car to take them back to the penthouse. As they finally escaped the prying eyes of the press and made their way to the relative safety of the car, the tension between them was palpable. William finally spoke, his voice low but determined. "I won't let them control our lives anymore." Alison glanced up at him, his jaw clenched in a mixture of anger and resolve. She knew the weight of the decision he was making. Stepping away from his company was not just a personal choice, it was a declaration. A rejection of the life he had built for himself. And the fallout would be monumental. But this was no longer about the board, or the press, or the empire he had spent years building. It was about them. It was about their future. The next few days were filled with tense meetings, phone calls, and media appearances. William had agreed to meet with his board, and it was clear from the moment they sat down that it wouldn't be easy. The room was cold, the air thick with hostility. The men around the table were not interested in his personal life. They weren't concerned with Elijah or his role as a father. They only cared about one thing: Carrington International. "William," his father's voice broke through the silence. "We need to discuss the future of the company. Your absence is already being felt. The board is not pleased." "I know," William said, his voice calm but unyielding. "And I'm prepared for the consequences." The room fell silent. His father's eyes narrowed, but William didn't look away. He wasn't going to back down. "I'm stepping down," William declared, his words like a bombshell dropped in the middle of the room. "I'm no longer going to run Carrington International. I've made my decision." "Do you understand what you're saying?" His father's voice was filled with disbelief. "You're throwing away everything, your legacy, your future." "No," William said, his gaze hardening. "I'm choosing something that matters more. My son, my family." The room erupted into chaos. The board members shouted over each other, angry and frustrated, but William stood firm, not backing down. Later that night, after the storm had settled and the press had begun to shift its focus back to the company's financial stability, William and Alison sat together in the penthouse. Elijah was sleeping peacefully in his crib, the soft hum of the night providing a sense of calm. "I didn't expect it to be easy," William said, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and relief. "But it feels right. I feel like I can finally breathe again." Alison smiled softly, her hand finding his. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, "for choosing us." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a tenderness she had never seen before. "I couldn't choose anything else. Not anymore. I was living a life I thought I wanted, but it was empty. You and Elijah, you're my future. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect that." For the first time since their return to Boston, Alison felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: it was a future she wanted to share with William and their son. The next day, William made the final decision that would solidify his new life. He would sell his shares in Carrington International. It was a massive risk, one that would shake the foundation of the company. But it was a risk he was willing to take for the chance at a real life, a life with the people he loved. He met with his attorney, finalizing the paperwork to transfer ownership. As the deal was signed, William's hands shook, not with fear but with anticipation. For the first time, he wasn't signing away his future, he was embracing it. And as he left the office that day, his phone buzzed with another notification from the press. Billionaire CEO William Carrington steps down, sells his shares. Is he choosing family over fortune? William smiled to himself. The press could spin their own story. He didn't care. His life was no longer about headlines. It was about the people he loved. As the days passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. William took on a more active role in Elijah's care, spending hours at the park with Alison and their son. They found joy in the small, everyday moments, laughing at Elijah's first attempts at crawling, watching him fall asleep in William's arms, spending quiet evenings together as a family. The storm had passed. The press attention had waned. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. They were a family. And nothing would ever take that away from them. The morning light poured softly through the windows of the penthouse as William stood at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee. He had traded in the relentless demands of the corporate world for the slower pace of home life, but the adjustment hadn't been easy. He was used to being at the helm of his empire, pulling the strings, making decisions. Now his most important job was being present for Alison, for Elijah, for their family. And yet, there was something liberating about it. He turned his gaze to Alison, who was sitting at the breakfast table, Elijah perched in her lap, his tiny hands reaching for his mother's face. Alison smiled down at him, her eyes soft with love. The sight was both grounding and exhilarating for William. He had never imagined that this sense of quiet connection would be what he craved most in life. "You're staring," Alison said, her voice light but warm. William smirked, setting his mug down and walking over to her. He kissed the top of her head, lingering there for a moment. "I'm just taking it all in," he murmured, his voice full of meaning. "This is real. We're real." Alison's smile widened, and she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a tenderness he hadn't seen in years. "It is real," she agreed, shifting Elijah in her arms as he gurgled happily. For a moment, the world outside the windows of their penthouse seemed far away. The media storm, the pressure from the board, all of it felt distant now. It was just the three of them in this bubble of love and possibility. And William knew, deep down, that he would do anything to protect it. Over the next few weeks, as the press coverage of his decision to leave Carrington International continued to fluctuate, William began to embrace his new role as a father and partner. He was no longer a billionaire CEO driven by profits and power. Instead, he was simply William, Alison's partner, Elijah's father, a man learning the joys of bottle feeding at 3 a.m. and the satisfaction of watching his son take his first steps. But despite his newfound peace at home, there were moments when the weight of his decision threatened to overwhelm him. The calls from his former colleagues, the messages from the board members who still expected him to return to the fold, each reminder of the life he'd left behind felt like a tug at his heart. One evening, as Alison put Elijah down for the night, William stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled, a stark contrast to the quiet life he now led. He couldn't ignore the pull of his past, the unfinished business that lingered in the boardroom. "Hey," Alison's voice interrupted his thoughts. She walked over to him, a gentle hand on his back. "You're thinking too hard." He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'm thinking about what comes next," he said quietly, turning to face her. "About how to make this, us. Work, long term. I want to build something with you. Something real. But I'm not sure what that looks like yet. Alison's expression softened. She took his hand in hers, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. We're building it already, she said, her voice steady. It's not about the company or the money, William. It's about us, about the family we're creating. We don't need to have it all figured out right now. We just need to keep moving forward. William met her gaze, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You make it sound so easy. It's not, she admitted. But I'm in this with you. I'm not going anywhere. William pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. I never thought I'd have something like this, he whispered into her hair. You, Elijah, a real family. I'm grateful, Alison. More than I know how to say. She smiled, pressing a kiss to his chest. I'm grateful too, she murmured. But we still have to figure out how to make it all work. It won't always be easy. William nodded, his gaze softening. We'll make it work. Together. As weeks turned into months, the Carrington name faded from the public eye. The media attention surrounding William's departure from the company eventually tapered off, though the whispers continued among the elite. William had been bold in his decision to walk away from everything he had worked for, and it had made headlines. But the story had evolved from one of scandal to one of redemption, and William was ready to embrace that narrative. On his terms. He began working with a few local charities, using his wealth and resources to give back to the community in ways that felt meaningful to him. It wasn't a grand gesture. He didn't make headlines for his efforts. But it was enough. He was doing something he could feel proud of. Alison also found herself thriving. She had started a small online business focused on motherhood and family health, an area she had always been passionate about. It was a slow build, but it was something that was entirely her own. She loved the sense of purpose it gave her, and she loved that she could be present for Elijah while still working toward her dreams. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their penthouse, Elijah playing at their feet, William looked out over the city once again, but this time, it felt different. I never realized how much I was missing, he said softly. I was so focused on building my empire that I didn't see what was right in front of me. Alison rested her head on his shoulder, her voice gentle. You were doing the best you could. We all are. He turned to her, his gaze intense. And now, he said with conviction, I'm going to do better. They sat in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. William's hand found Alison's, their fingers entwining, a promise of everything they had built and everything they would continue to build. Months later, William stood in the living room, looking around at their home. The life they had created was more than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that he was no longer chasing something. He wasn't running after wealth, success, or power. He was running toward something, toward his family, toward love, toward a future that was grounded in something real. Together, they had built something better than anything he could have achieved alone. And that, he realized, was his greatest legacy. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of their penthouse, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. William sat at the breakfast table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, and yet, as the days passed, it felt as though they had all settled into a new normal. Alison was busy in the kitchen, her soft humming filling the air as she prepared breakfast for Elijah. Her movements were effortless, graceful even, and watching her, William couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. It wasn't just for the woman she was, but for the life they were building together, a life that, for the first time, truly felt like his own. But beneath the calm, there was a rising tension in the pit of his stomach. It had been weeks since he made the final decision to sell his shares in Carrington International. The fallout from his choice was far from over, and though he was no longer the CEO, he couldn't ignore the subtle pressure of his past still lurking at the edges of his life. His father, the board, the media, they had all been quiet for now, but William knew that wasn't permanent. He couldn't run from his past forever. "Are you okay?" Alison's voice brought him back to the present. She stood in the doorway, Elijah cradled in her arms, her gaze filled with concern. William smiled at her, trying to mask the turmoil he was feeling inside. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though his tone was far from convincing. Alison raised an eyebrow, a familiar look of skepticism crossing her face. "William." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, staring down into his coffee. "It's just, I can't shake the feeling that everything's about to change again. I thought selling my shares would be the end of it, that I could finally step away. But now I'm starting to wonder if I really can escape it." Alison walked over and sat beside him, Elijah settling into her lap. She looked at him carefully, her eyes soft but unwavering. "You can't escape your past," she said, her voice steady. "But you don't have to let it control you either. You've made a choice. A hard choice. And you've built something new with me. With us." William looked up, meeting her gaze. There was a quiet strength in her words, an unspoken promise that no matter what happened, they would face it together. "I know," he murmured, his heart swelling with emotion. "But what if they won't let me go? What if the board or my father make things difficult? What if they try to drag me back into that world?" Alison's hand found his, her fingers wrapping around his in a silent gesture of support. "Then we face it. Together. You don't have to do it alone." He smiled softly at her, the weight on his shoulders lightening, if only for a moment. There was something about her belief in him, in them, that gave him strength. She was right. He couldn't change the past, but he could control the present. And the present was filled with the people he loved, the people he was willing to fight for. Later that afternoon, after a quiet morning spent with Elijah and a long conversation about their future, William finally made the call. He had avoided it for weeks, but it was time to face the reality of his decision. He dialed his father's number, the familiar dread in his stomach rising as the phone rang. When his father finally answered, there was no surprise in his voice, just a cold, calculating tone that William had come to expect. "You've been avoiding me," his father said, his voice edged with impatience. "I know," William said, standing and walking to the large windows of their penthouse. He could feel the weight of the conversation, the tension that had been building for months. "But I've made my decision. I'm not going back to Carrington International. I'm done with it." His father was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a new sharpness to his words. "You're making a mistake, William. You're throwing away everything we've worked for. The company needs you." "I'm sorry, but I can't do it anymore," William said, his voice firm. "I made a promise to myself, and to Alison and Elijah, that I'm going to be present. I'm going to be the father and partner they need me to be. I can't do that while running a company like Carrington." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and William could almost hear his father's mind working, calculating his next move. Finally, his father spoke, his tone low and dangerous. "You'll regret this, William," he warned. "And when you do, don't come crawling back." "I won't," William said quietly, his resolve unwavering. "This is the life I've chosen, and I'm not looking back." With that, he hung up, the finality of his decision settling over him like a weight. For the first time in years, he felt free, but it was a freedom that came with sacrifice. The next morning, the consequences of his decision began to make themselves known. A notification popped up on his phone, an urgent news alert from a business outlet. William clicked on it, his heart sinking as he read the headline. Carrington International faces uncertainty after CEO William Carrington steps down and sells shares. What's next for the billion-dollar empire? The article was filled with speculation about the company's future, with analysts questioning whether Carrington International could survive without its charismatic leader. But what caught William's eye was the closing paragraph, which mentioned his father's recent comments about the transition. William Carrington's decision to abandon the company has left many questioning his commitment to his family legacy, the article read. With his absence, it's unclear who will take charge of the company moving forward. William tossed his phone down, frustration bubbling to the surface. It was exactly what he'd feared. His father was framing this as a betrayal. And the media, as always, was quick to latch onto the narrative. Alison, who had been in the other room, walked in just as he dropped the phone onto the table. She could see the storm brewing in his eyes. "Another article?" she asked, her voice calm but understanding. "Yeah," he muttered. "Same old story. My father's not going to let this go easily. He's already planting the seed that I've abandoned the family business." Alison sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "You didn't abandon anything, William. You chose a different path. A better path. And I believe in you." His gaze softened, gratitude filling his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words heavy with meaning. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "I'm not going anywhere," Alison replied, her voice steady and reassuring. "We're in this together. Always." William took a deep breath, the tension easing ever so slightly as he leaned into her touch. The future was uncertain. The fallout from his decision had only just begun. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a clear sense of direction. He was doing the right thing. And with Alison and Elijah by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The days following the article's release were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and media inquiries. William had expected the fallout, but he hadn't anticipated the relentless nature of the storm. His father's influence in the business world was vast, and though William had walked away from Carrington International, he could still feel the weight of that legacy hanging over him. But despite the mounting pressure, William refused to waver in his decision. He had chosen Alison and Elijah over everything else, and that choice was non-negotiable. One evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, casting the city in a warm golden hue, William stood by the window of their penthouse, watching the lights flicker on in the distance. The city felt both distant and close, a reminder of the life he had left behind. Alison walked in, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her presence grounding him. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, knowing the toll the past few weeks had taken on him. William let out a deep breath, his gaze lingering on the city below before he turned to face her. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying exhaustion. "It's just this whole thing with the company and my father. It's like the world hasn't stopped spinning, and I'm just here trying to figure out how to move forward." Alison smiled softly, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "You're moving forward, William. Maybe not in the way everyone expects, but you're building something better." He chuckled, the sound faint. "I just wish I knew what that better looks like." Alison looked at him with unwavering certainty. "It looks like us, Elijah. This life we're building together. That's what matters now." William's heart swelled at her words. There had been a time when he believed his success was defined by his position in the corporate world, by the numbers, the power, the endless accolades. But now, standing here with Alison, watching her with Elijah in her arms, he realized that true success wasn't measured by how much money you made or how powerful you were. It was measured by the love you gave and received. "I don't think I could have ever imagined this," he murmured, stepping closer to her. "This life. You, Elijah. It's everything. Alison's smile deepened, and she pulled him into a gentle embrace. We're building it together. You don't have to do it alone anymore. For a moment, William closed his eyes, allowing himself to sink into the warmth of her embrace. The world outside could keep turning, the media could keep speculating, but none of it mattered. Not anymore. What mattered was the family he had found in Alison and Elijah, the people who had brought meaning back into his life. The next morning, after a restless night filled with thoughts about his future, William found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him. It was time to take action. His old self would have jumped straight into finding a solution, but the man he was now had to approach this differently. He had spent enough time chasing someone else's dream. It was time to build his own. Alison entered the kitchen, Elijah nestled against her chest in a baby carrier. She paused when she saw the papers spread across the table, a mix of legal documents, business plans, and notes. "What are you working on?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. William looked up at her, a sense of resolve in his eyes. "I've been thinking. I've spent my whole life building someone else's empire. It's time I build something of my own. Something that's about more than just profits." Alison's eyebrows arched in surprise. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, pushing the papers aside to focus solely on her. "I want to create something that matters. I want to invest in causes that align with who I am now. I've seen firsthand how hard it is for people to make a living, to support their families, and I want to be part of the solution. I want to create a foundation for children's health, to provide better care for families who need it. And I want you by my side." Alison's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him, her hand resting on the table. "William, that's amazing. But do you think it's the right time? After everything that's happened?" William nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know it's risky, but the world needs more than just corporate giants. It needs compassion, it needs change. And I can't sit by and do nothing anymore. I've spent so much of my life focused on power and success. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to build something that lasts. Something we can leave behind." Alison's expression turned thoughtful as she processed his words. Then, after a moment of silence, she smiled, a sense of pride filling her eyes. "I'm in," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Whatever you need. I believe in you. In us." William's heart swelled with gratitude. For so long, he had believed that his worth was tied to what he could achieve in the boardroom. But now, he realized his true legacy would be built on love, on helping others, and on creating a future where he and Alison could make a real difference. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, planning sessions, and late nights spent brainstorming. William and Alison worked side by side, forging a path that was entirely their own. They started small, focusing on a handful of key initiatives in the children's healthcare sector, but the impact was already beginning to be felt. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, William found himself not only healing but thriving in ways he never expected. He was no longer defined by his company or his father's legacy. He was defined by the love he gave, the family he had built, and the changes he was making in the world. One evening, after a long day of meetings, William returned home to find Alison and Elijah waiting for him. As he walked into the living room, his heart lightened at the sight of them. Elijah was crawling across the floor, laughing as Alison encouraged him, and William felt an overwhelming rush of love. Alison looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. "How was your day?" William smiled, setting his briefcase down. He kneeled beside Elijah, scooping him up and holding him close. "It was a good day," he said softly. "We're making progress. And I'm finally starting to see what I've always been looking for." Alison's smile deepened, her hand resting on his shoulder. "And what's that?" He looked at her, his voice full of emotion. "A future. A future where we get to choose who we are and what we stand for. They sat together on the floor, the three of them, and for the first time in a long while, William felt at peace. The future wasn't uncertain anymore. It was theirs to shape. The seasons had shifted. The crisp air of autumn wrapped the city in a cool embrace, and the leaves outside their penthouse windows had begun to turn shades of gold and crimson. It was a time of change, both in the world outside and in William's heart. He had always been a man who sought control, who thrived in the world of business, numbers, and power. But now, as he walked through the quiet hallways of their home, cradling Elijah in his arms, he understood that true control wasn't about dominating the world. It was about the quiet, steady moments with the people he loved most. Alison stood in the kitchen, a soft smile on her face as she prepared breakfast. Her movements were easy, familiar, and William couldn't help but marvel at how well they had adjusted to this new life. A life far removed from the chaos of the boardroom and the pressures of Carrington International. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm as he walked over to her, Elijah giggling in his arms. Alison turned to him, her face lighting up with a smile that never failed to brighten his day. "Good morning," she replied. "How's our little troublemaker?" William kissed Elijah's cheek, his heart swelling with love. "He's as mischievous as ever. But I wouldn't change a thing." Alison laughed softly, her eyes softening as she gazed at their son. "Neither would I." They stood there for a moment, the soft hum of the morning settling around them. There was peace in the air, something that had been absent from William's life for so long. He could feel it deep in his bones, the tranquility of having found the life he had been searching for without even knowing it. Yet, as with all things in life, their peace wouldn't last forever. Later that afternoon, as the three of them spent time at the park watching Elijah take his first wobbly steps, William's phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it, his stomach tightening as he saw the name on the screen. It was from his father. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but the weight of the situation pressed on him. His father had been eerily silent for weeks, but he knew that silence could only last so long. "Excuse me for a second," William said to Alison, his tone apologetic as he stepped away to answer the call. The moment he picked up, his father's voice filled the line, cold and clipped. "William." "Father," William replied, trying to keep his voice even. "What is it?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "I've heard some troubling things, William. About the foundation. The investments you're making, are you sure this is the direction you want to go? You're throwing away everything we've built." William exhaled slowly, fighting the rising frustration in his chest. "I'm sure, Father. This is the future I want. It's not about the business or the empire anymore. It's about making a difference." Another pause. Then his father spoke, his voice laced with a hint of disdain. "You think this foundation will replace what you've walked away from? It's a fool's errand, William. You'll never get back what you've lost. And don't think for a second that your decision hasn't affected me." William clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. "I made my choice, and I won't regret it. I'm building a life for my family, not for a company that doesn't care about me." There was a long silence on the other end, before his father finally spoke again. "You've made a mistake. And when it all falls apart, don't come to me." The call ended abruptly, and William stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He had expected anger, but the coldness in his father's voice stung more than he had anticipated. It was the final, unspoken rejection of the man he used to be. But William knew, deep down, that it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't that person anymore. And no matter how much his father tried to pull him back into the world of power and greed, William had a new family now. He had Alison and Elijah. And that was all that mattered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, playtime with Elijah, grocery shopping, and dinner at the kitchen table, where the three of them laughed and talked as though the world outside didn't exist. The noise from the outside world, the media, the business world, all of it seemed distant, irrelevant. But that night, as they sat on the couch, the quiet hum of the apartment wrapping around them, William couldn't shake the lingering feeling that his father's words still had weight. Alison noticed his distant expression and placed her hand gently on his arm. "What's on your mind?" He sighed, his thoughts swirling. "It's my father. He's still trying to drag me back into that world. I thought I was done with it, but it seems like he's not letting go." Alison's expression softened, her eyes filled with understanding. "You can't control what he says or does, William, but you can control how you respond. And you've already made your decision." He turned to her, his heart heavy. "I know, but it's hard, Alison, to know that I've made a choice he'll never accept. It's like I'm losing him all over again." Alison squeezed his hand, her voice steady and comforting. "You haven't lost him, William. Not yet. But if you're going to truly embrace the life you want, you can't keep holding onto a version of your father that no longer exists. You have to let go." William stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself to a man who would never be satisfied with anything less than total control. But the person he needed to prove himself to now was the man he had become. The father, the partner, the person who mattered more than any legacy. "I'm not going back to that life," William said, his voice resolute. "I'm done with it. I've made my peace." Alison smiled softly, the warmth in her eyes a balm for the ache in his chest. "And we're moving forward. Together." William nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Together," he echoed, the word carrying more weight than he could have ever imagined. And in that moment, he knew, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs to shape. Together. The sun streamed in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Boston penthouse. It had been 2 weeks since William faced his father's final call, the last tether to the man he used to be. Now, that version of himself was slowly shedding like an old skin, making room for the man he was becoming. Alison sat at the kitchen island with Elijah perched on her hip, feeding him pieces of banana as he babbled happily. William, dressed more casually than ever before in jeans and a sweater, poured coffee into 2 mugs. "Sleep well?" he asked, sliding one mug toward her. She gave him a sleepy smile. "Mostly. Elijah woke up once, but I think he just wanted a cuddle." William grinned. "Smart kid. Knows where the comfort is." They shared a quiet moment, sipping coffee and watching Elijah attempt to feed himself. The simple scene would have seemed mundane to anyone else, but to William, it was revolutionary. This was the life he hadn't known he needed. But a knock at the door broke the morning calm. William opened it to find Marcus, his longtime legal counsel and now the acting chair of the Carrington Foundation, holding a tablet and wearing a look of urgency. "Morning," Marcus said, stepping inside. "Sorry to barge in, but this couldn't wait." Alison looked up, instantly alert. William gave her a reassuring look before turning to Marcus. "What's going on?" Marcus placed the tablet on the island and brought up a news article. The headline read, "Carrington CEO quits company to raise secret child? Anonymous sources speak out." Alison's stomach sank. William's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. "They leaked it," Marcus said. "And now the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They want to ensure the foundation isn't just a vanity project to save face." William looked at Alison, then at his son, still giggling, still innocent to the weight of the world pressing on their family. "I won't hide him," William said quietly. "Not Elijah. Not Alison. They're my life now. If the board can't handle that, then they're the ones with the problem. Marcus nodded, but his eyes were wary. Then be prepared. The press will swarm. Your name's everywhere. But there's another side to this. William arched an eyebrow. What is it? Marcus hesitated. There's interest in the foundation. Real interest. People are watching to see if this is the fall of Carrington or the rise of something new. If we play it right, this could be your legacy. William let the words sink in. Legacy. Not power. Not wealth. Not influence. But something meaningful, rooted in truth. He turned to Alison, who hadn't spoken but whose eyes said everything. Fear. Strength. Hope. What do you want to do? She asked him softly. He stepped forward, placing a hand on hers. I want to rebuild. On my terms. With you and Elijah at the center of it. She squeezed his fingers. Then let's do it. That afternoon, William walked into the boardroom, not as the CEO of Carrington International, but as the founder of the Carrington Foundation. Alison stayed home with Elijah, but her strength was with him. The room fell silent as he stepped in. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, some expectant, some cold, some curious. He stood at the head of the table and spoke. Yes, I left the company. Yes, I have a child. And yes, I had that child for a time. But not out of shame. Out of fear that the world I came from would eat him alive before he even took his first steps. He paused, steadying his breath. But I'm not ashamed anymore. My son saved me. His mother gave up everything to protect him. And I'm not going to apologize for choosing them over an empire built on appearances. If that means I lose everything else, so be it. Silence. Then, slowly, a voice from the end of the table. I read your foundation's mission. Affordable healthcare. Education for single mothers. Real action, not just PR fluff. A middle-aged woman in a gray suit leaned forward. If this is what you're doing now, count me in. Another voice chimed in. Same here. About time we did something that matters. By the time the meeting ended, the foundation had not only survived the scandal, it had been reborn from it. The board gave their vote of confidence, and William walked out not as a disgraced CEO, but as a man who had found a new purpose. That night, he returned home to find Alison rocking Elijah by the window. You did it, she said, rising to meet him. No, William said, wrapping his arms around them both. We did it. All of this. It's just the beginning. Outside, the city glowed with promise. Inside, a family, once fractured by silence, was whole again. The morning was unusually quiet for Boston. Stillness hung in the air like a held breath, unnatural for a city always on the move. But inside the Carrington penthouse, life stirred with new meaning. Alison scrolled through her phone as William prepared Elijah's bottle, the morning news buzzing low in the background. Headlines flashed across the screen. From power to parenthood, William Carrington's public rebirth. Carrington's foundation gains momentum after personal revelation. Billionaire father chooses family over fortune. Her thumb hovered over one headline, her stomach tightening. It featured a candid photo of William holding Elijah with one arm, shielding them both from paparazzi with the other. She remembered that moment vividly, the chaos, the flashing cameras, the questions shouted from behind barriers. And William's calm through it all. He handed her the bottle and kissed the top of her head. You don't have to look at those, he murmured. I know, she said. But I want to. Because you didn't run. You stood there and claimed us. He looked down at her, the tiredness in his face softened by gratitude. I don't want to hide anymore. Not who I love. Not what matters. They sat together on the couch, watching Elijah drink, blissfully unaware of how his life had changed the trajectory of a man once groomed for boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. The following day, The Carrington Foundation held its first major press conference at the public library, a symbolic gesture of open access and transparency. The large hall buzzed with anticipation as reporters, donors, and critics took their seats. William stood backstage, adjusting his tie while Alison sat nearby, holding Elijah, who wore a little blue sweater and khaki pants. The picture of innocence. "You ready?" Alison asked, her tone gentle. William smiled. "Honestly? No. But I'm going out there anyway." She took his hand and squeezed it. That's what makes it brave. When he stepped onto the stage, the cameras clicked instantly. The lights were blinding, but the fear he once might have felt was replaced with clarity. He stood behind the podium and began. "I used to believe that strength came from control, from perfection. That success meant never showing weakness, never allowing your personal life to interfere with business. But I've learned something far more important, that true strength comes from vulnerability, from standing in the light even when it's uncomfortable." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "I have a son. His name is Elijah. He's the reason I left the company, not to escape, but to evolve. I wanted to build something that he, and others like him, could be proud of. The Carrington Foundation is my legacy, born not from power, but from love." Cameras flashed. Whispers rippled. But no one interrupted. "I'm not perfect. I made mistakes, hid truths. But I won't hide anymore. I want the world to know Alison and Elijah. Not as secrets, but as the heart of everything I do." When he stepped away from the podium, he reached for Alison, guiding her and Elijah onto the stage. Alison's hand trembled slightly in his, but she held her head high. There was a moment of stunned silence in the crowd, followed by a slow clap, then another and another, until the room was filled with applause. Not everyone would accept them, but enough would. And that was all they needed. That night, they walked hand in hand through Boston Common, pushing Elijah's stroller under the amber glow of street lamps. The city felt different, less imposing, more familiar. Like it was theirs now. "You made a speech today that changed people's hearts," Alison said, her voice soft with admiration. "I just told the truth," William replied. "Something I should have done a long time ago." They stopped near a fountain where the lights danced across the rippling water. William turned to her. "Marry me." Alison blinked, startled. "What?" "Not for the press. Not for redemption. Just for us. For this life we're building. For Elijah. For every moment we've fought to reclaim." She stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, slowly, tears welled up as she nodded. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Snow blanketed the hills around the lake house in Vermont, where the world felt quieter, simpler, like time had paused just for them. Alison stood in front of the tall mirror in the bedroom that had once held her grief and fear. Now it held promise. Her dress wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect, an ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that brushed the floor. Her hair was pinned in soft curls, a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. She held a bouquet of winter roses and eucalyptus, fragrant and frost-kissed. Elijah's all bundled up. Jane, one of William's house staff and now a dear friend, smiled as she entered. He's sitting with Marcus, trying to eat the boutonniere. Alison laughed, nerves fluttering in her chest. "Of course he is." Jane stepped closer, hands gently adjusting the veil. "You're ready." Outside, the lake glimmered under a pale winter sun. A small group of guests had gathered, just close friends, a few board members who had stood by William, and the family they were building together. At the altar, William waited in a charcoal suit, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. His heart thundered in his chest, not from nerves, but from joy that felt almost too big for his body to hold. And then he saw her. Alison stepped out of the house, holding Elijah in one arm, her dress trailing behind her in the snow like a whispered secret. William's breath caught. She was radiant, not because of the dress or the setting, but because of the love that lived in her eyes. She passed Elijah to Marcus at the end of the aisle, who wiped his eyes discreetly and whispered, "You're marrying a queen, Will." William chuckled softly, nodding. "I know." When Alison reached him, their hands found each other instinctively. The minister, a family friend of Alison's, began the ceremony. "You found each other not in perfect timing," he said, "but in truth. And from that truth, you've built something that can never be taken by scandal or fear." They exchanged vows, words they had written late at night in quiet moments, by Elijah's crib or on walks through the snow. Words about second chances, about seeing each other clearly, about never running again. "I promise," Alison whispered, "to walk with you, even when the path is steep. To hold your hand, even when it trembles. And to believe in us, no matter what the world says." William's voice shook as he replied, "I promise to choose you every day. To protect this family with everything I am. And to be the man you and Elijah deserve." When they kissed, the world fell away. Snow fell around them in slow, soft spirals. Elijah clapped from Marcus's lap, babbling happily as if he knew what had just happened. That evening, the lake house glowed with warmth. Fireplaces crackled, laughter echoed through the wood-paneled rooms, and glasses clinked in quiet celebration. Alison danced with Elijah in her arms, his sleepy head resting on her shoulder. William watched them from across the room, his heart so full he could hardly breathe. Later, wrapped in a quilt on the porch swing, William pulled her close. "Do you ever think about the day we met again?" he asked. "When you left, and I didn't chase you?" She looked at him. "Every day. I should have fought for you then." Alison shook her head, smiling softly. "We weren't ready. We had to become who we are now." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you for not giving up." "I never did," she whispered. "I just waited for this moment." As the stars shimmered over the frozen lake and the world hushed beneath winter's blanket, Alison, William, and Elijah, once separated by circumstance and fear, were now bound by choice, love, and a future they were ready to embrace. Spring came gently to Boston. The city thawed, shedding its icy coat for cherry blossoms and morning sunshine. The Carrington Foundation headquarters bustled with renewed purpose. Inside, polished marble floors echoed with purposeful footsteps, not just of executives, but of young mothers with children, healthcare advocates, and educators drawn to a cause that now felt deeply human. On the top floor, behind a glass wall that once symbolized distance, William Carrington stood at his desk, holding Elijah on his hip. "Should I sign it?" he asked, handing Elijah a pen. Elijah babbled in response, jabbing the paper with toddler enthusiasm. William laughed. "A solid yes, then." The document was the final approval of a new wing of the foundation, the Elijah Initiative, a program offering medical grants and support to single parents with critically ill children. Born from pain, now a beacon of hope. Downstairs, Alison walked through the community wing, where soft play mats and children's books lined the shelves. She was no longer just the woman who once worked 2 jobs and prayed in emergency rooms. She was now the director of family programs, using her experience to shape real solutions. Every decision she made, every policy she touched, came from the heart she once shielded in silence. Later that afternoon, the 3 of them met in the public garden. Elijah waddled across the grass, now strong and full of giggles, chasing butterflies and clouds. Alison sat on a bench, sketching out ideas in her notebook. William joined her, sliding an arm around her shoulder. "I spoke to the board today," he said. "Told them I want to step down completely next year. Let the new leadership take over. Alison looked up, surprised. You're really ready? He nodded. I don't want Elijah to grow up watching me disappear behind boardroom doors. I want to coach his t-ball games. Make him pancakes on Saturdays. Be there. A soft wind danced through the leaves. And us? She asked. What do we do with all this time? We write books. Plant gardens. Maybe give Elijah a sibling or two. He smiled. Build a legacy that doesn't just live in buildings or headlines, but in bedtime stories and first steps. Alison leaned her head against his shoulder, tears warming her eyes. We already have. Look at him. Elijah ran toward them, arms outstretched, laughing as he launched himself into their arms. There, in the middle of the city, in the echo of traffic and laughter and wind, the Carringtons were no longer hiding, no longer fractured. They were whole. 1 year later, the front page of the Boston Chronicle featured a smiling family beneath the headline. From boardroom to backyard, the Carringtons redefine what it means to lead. Inside, a full spread showed William planting vegetables with Elijah, Alison reading to a group of children at the foundation's new wing, and a quote etched in stone at the building's entrance. Love built this, and love keeps it standing. The legacy of wealth, of power, of privilege, none of it mattered more than this. The quiet triumph of a mother's courage, a father's awakening, and a little boy who brought them back together. Their story had once been a secret. Now it was a legacy. The end.